Hello everybody, welcome to another video. And in today's video we're going to be talking about ABGs. What are ABGs and what do they tell us? What can they be used for? Why are they important? How do you interpret them? So we're going to get into all of that, and hopefully we all take away something from today's video. So first of all, what is an ABG? Well, we'll get into that. Let's say that you are a medical student. Let's say that's you. And a doctor, the senior most respiratory consultant, comes up to you and says, get an ABG for me, and I want you to interpret the results. So, you, being the brave person that you are, decide to approach a patient and you explain to them what you're going to do. You are going to tell them that you are going to take some blood from their wrist, and this blood is going to be from an artery. So this gives you arterial blood. And this blood is going to give us some answers as to what is going on in the body. So how are you going to take it? Well, let's find out. What is an ABG? It's also known as an arterial blood gas. And it's called an arterial blood gas because arterial blood is the sample you're taking, and the word gas comes from the type of syringe that you're going to use, which is known as a gas syringe. We also have venous blood gases, which are taken using a similar syringe as well. So now let's say that we want to take the patient's ABG. So what we do is we ask the patient to put their hand on a pillow or any elevated surface, and we feel for their radial artery. So this is a common question that they might ask you on the ward, which is, name this artery, or which artery is being used. So this is the radial artery. You can actually feel this on yourself right now. So towards your thumb side, or phalange or phalanx, just if you were to hold your hand out in front of you and feel down from the back of your thumb until you reach a small dip in your hand, that dip is called the anatomical snuff box. Now, going towards your palm side, if you put two fingers around that level, you might start to feel a small pulsating beat. So that pulse is coming from what's called the radial artery. So what we ask the patient to do is to lay their hand on a cushion or elevated surface, and what we do next is we get the syringe and we tell the patient that we are going to put the syringe into this artery. When the syringe finds its way into the artery, it will slowly start to fill with blood, and you don't need too much for it to work. This syringe can then be sent to a machine. A little bit about what's happening to the blood. So the blood is given to the machine, and the machine gives you the following information. Now, for those who are in this video that are a little bit more experienced and confident with ABGs, okay, so let's move forward. For the majority of you who have clicked on this video not knowing what an ABG is, you're probably flummoxed with all the numbers and different letters that are on screen right now, but we're going to go through each one accordingly. So let's start with the basics. What is pH? So I've drawn a really weird, complicated equation here, but it's really not that difficult to understand. All it says is that pH is the inverse of the number or concentration, if you want to be more specific, of 8 plus ions. So drawn on a graph, if this is pH on the x-axis and the y-axis is our protons, so smaller the pH, the larger the number of protons, and the bigger the pH, the less number of protons. So just so that we get that clear, like higher pH means less protons, and a lower pH means greater protons. Okay, so when we see a patient who typically who has a higher pH or higher than the boundary, this probably tells us something is going on inside the patient's blood, and the same can be said for the opposite. So when we see that the pH is less than the expected, or there's too many protons or H plus ions in the blood, we call this acidic, or in the blood we call it acidosis. And when the pH is higher and or when the pH in the blood is higher and therefore the proton ions is less, we call it basic or alkalotic. Okay, so let's go back to our example and try telling me, based on the numbers given to you, is this patient acidotic or alkalotic? Okay, so based on this number and using this reference range, you'll see that this is less than the lower boundary. So this number is less than the lower boundary. So we say that this patient is acidotic. Okay, so that tells us a little bit, but a very important amount of information about the patient's condition. Amazing. So now we know that the patient's acidotic, which means we know that something might be wrong with the patient, but we don't know what's causing it, and we don't know what in particular could be wrong with the patient, because an acidotic patient can mean many things. So let's move further. We have a few more clues. Now, I want to focus on these in particular. So your oxygen levels, your PCO2 levels, and your bicarbonate levels. These help to point towards if something in particular is wrong with the patient and what might be wrong with the patient. Because it's very possible that the pH stays the same, but if these levels are not the same and not managed appropriately, then we should still be aware of what that could do to the pH and why the pH is the way it is. So, try to answer the following questions. Which organ regulates CO2? And which organ regulates bicarbonate? Try to pause the video and try to answer the questions. Okay, so to remember the answers, it's all about trying to make sense of it. You're probably using this organ right now as we're watching this video, and that is the lungs. So when you breathe it in, you're bringing in oxygen. Your body uses the oxygen for metabolism, and then it comes out as CO2. When you breathe out, you're getting rid of CO2. When you hold in your breath and you're holding on to all of the developing CO2, the CO2 in your body rises. But when you're breathing out, you're trying to decrease the amount of CO2 in your body. Okay, what about the other one, HCO3? So if you think back to your renal studies, what you might find is that in the proximal convoluted tubule, so imagine that this is a nephron. So we've got the glomerulus forming there, and then we've got our proximal convoluted tubule turning into the thick ascending limb, thin ascending, loop of Henle, thick ascending, and distal, and then the collecting tubes. Fantastic. So in this part of the nephron, the PCT, we have cells which are responsible for the reabsorption of a lot of different chemicals, but in particular HCO3. So the nephron, this structure, is a functional unit of the kidneys. Now, if that's the case, so excuse the poor drawings, but one has got the lungs involved and one's got the kidneys involved. And the kidneys affect on the body's metabolism overall. Now, why are these two so intimately connected to one another? How is it that the level of PCO2 affects pH and the level of HCO3 can affect pH? So both organs regulate these molecules, and these molecules are connected using the drawings that are seen on screen. Now, obviously, there is a lot on here, but I will try to exemplify it by simply narrowing down one equation that needs to be remembered. And simply put, it is this. So if I wrote it out for you, it would be bicarbonate and H plus ions make H2CO3 using carbonic acid anhydrase enzyme, which splits into water and CO2. Now, what we try to do when these things happen is we try to push CO2 out using the lungs in exchange for oxygen, which is seen here, being put into the alveolus to replace with oxygen. Or if that isn't going to happen, we can also use the kidneys to trade in the carbon dioxide for bicarbonate, which is why we tend to see that there's a little bit more bicarb in the blood as opposed to carbon dioxide. And that's why in our pH levels, blood tends to be slightly basic in order for it to maintain a healthy environment. So they both regulate pH. So because of this fine balance, if something doesn't work, if the kidneys aren't doing their part, if the body's not metabolizing these molecules properly, the lungs are not doing their job, the pH will sway, either go up or down. Now, when the pH goes down, the protein ions go up. So how is this translated in terms of our physiology? Well, let's take CO2. Let's say that the body has produced a bunch of CO2 and we're not getting rid of it. So when this goes up and we are not getting rid of it, what ends up happening is a lot of these ions start to back up. A lot of the ions, H plus ions, start to back up. But in bicarb, what happens is when the bicarb starts to back up, it's not getting replaced by the H plus ions. So a raised bicarb means that this is not getting translated, the carbon dioxide and the water is not getting translated into bicarb and proton ions. As a result, the pH goes up whilst this goes down. The proton ions go down. So, which is why, as a rule of thumb, when CO2 is up, pH goes down. When bicarb goes up, pH goes up. So now that we have these key rules of thumb in place, we can actually start to make more sense of why things happen the way they do and how we can sort of classify it so that we can discuss it when we are trying to solve a patient's case. So the way I like to remember it, which has really saved me during exams, is trying to understand that ABGs are a blame game. When a patient is sick and we see a weird ABG, all we're trying to find out is who screwed up the pH and who is trying to carry the team so that whoever is lacking gets supported. So let's figure this out. Let's say that somebody, or in this case, this patient, has acidosis, but they also have a raised PCO2, and they've also got a raised bicarbonate. So both are raised. How am I supposed to know which one's causing the acidosis? Well, we go back to our physiology. When a patient has raised PCO2 or a decreased pH, it's typically because of a raised CO2. So in this case, we see that a patient has a decreased pH, but they have a raised PCO2. So that becomes decreased pH and a raised CO2. Because this patient has a decreased pH, we say acidosis, as we have already explained. And because the patient's CO2 was managed by the lungs, we call it a respiratory problem. So we call this respiratory acidosis. So what does that mean? The lungs are holding on to too much carbon dioxide, which means that the pH is starting to fall because of an extreme rise of proton ions building in the blood. But that doesn't explain this. Why is the bicarbonate raised? Well, this is because somebody screwed up. So we have figured out that someone screwed up, it's the lungs. But someone might be carrying the team. Who's trying to carry the team right now? Well, the answer is the kidneys, because here we see a raised HCO3. So when the body is in acidosis, it kind of says, I don't like that very much. I prefer when everything is normal. So the kidneys say, don't worry, I can handle this. So what it will do to counteract the decrease in pH is the body will raise the HCO3. This should cause a raised pH, which should normalize it. But this doesn't always happen, and in this case, it's not happening. So what happens when it doesn't happen? What do we say, or what do we classify that as? So here the body is trying, but is not successful. So we are trying to, we call this compensation. So the kidneys are trying to compensate for the lungs' work. Yes, the body is trying to compensate. Are they successful? Not quite. So we call this partial compensation. So I've decided to just move this out here. So just to reiterate, when the body produces, when there's a abnormality in the ABG, the body will try to compensate for the problem. So if the lungs are not doing their job, the kidneys will kick in. The kidneys are not doing their job, the lungs kick in. So we call that compensation. Now, the body may or may not be successful at compensating for the pH. So how do you tell if a patient's compensating properly? If the pH changes. So how do we classify this? So try to raise pH or decrease pH by either causing a raised or decreased CO2 or a raised or decreased HCO3. Now, if the body is successful, as in, yes, it does compensate, then we ask, is the body able to do it appropriately, or is it achieving full compensation? If the answer is yes, so how do we know if something's compensated? The pH is normal. Just because the pH is normal doesn't mean that the body's okay. But what it means is the body is able to keep up despite the fact that something is wrong. So when the body compensates and it's successfully able to compensate, then we say full or complete compensation. Now, let's say that the body does try to compensate, but it's not successful. The pH stays the same. So that is seen in the patient example that's above. We say that this is only a partial compensation. So it's trying, and it might go somewhere, but right now it's not really going anywhere. So we say it's partially there. But what if it doesn't compensate at all? And so because it's not compensating, obviously the pH is not going to improve. Well, then we say that there is no compensation. This either means one of two things. Either you're very good because the body will correct itself. So if the lungs are struggling, then the lungs will fix it themselves. They don't need the kidneys' help. And the opposite is also true. Or you're doing really bad because it means the body is giving up. So now with that out of the way, let's go back to our example. So here we see that the patient is got a raised PCO2, which means that that's causing the acidosis, which is why we've said respiratory acidosis. But they've also got a raised bicarb. Now, because they've got a raised bicarb, we have to ask ourselves, is the kidney successfully trying to complete the compensation? In this case, it's not, because the pH is still down. So we can say that because it has compensated, or it's trying to, but it is unsuccessful, we say that this is a partial metabolic, because it is to do with the kidneys, compensation. So what does this ABG show us? It shows us now when you explain it to the consultant, the ABG shows respiratory acidosis with partial metabolic compensation. So that is the name of the game. We have figured out that it was the lungs trying to screw with the pH, and it was the kidneys trying to carry the team by trying to compensate for the increase in CO2 by bringing the HCO3 up so that the pH levels out to becoming normal. We're going to look at more examples in a later video.